All right, welcome back to class, guys, and we are in the process of the second half of wrapping up module number 5. We've just looked at the obsessive compulsive and related disorders section of the DSM, and we highlighted in that section two different mental health conditions: hoarding disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. And the key thing with both of those disorders is, sometimes the name of these different diagnoses, they kind of are what they say they are. Hoarding disorder tells us what it is. It is a disorder that is connected to the behavior of hoarding. Obsessive compulsive disorder, it is what it says it is, OCD. It is a disorder that is characterized by two key symptoms: obsessions and compulsions. And that's also true for this one diagnosis that we want to talk about in the trauma and stressor related disorder family, and that is PTSD, or post traumatic stress disorder. And again, this is another one of those situations where this disorder or diagnosis or condition, it is what it says it is. Post traumatic means after trauma. Post traumatic means after trauma, after a trauma or traumatic event or events. Stress, PTSS, is stress or anxiety. After a trauma, stress. And the D disorder means that that stress rises to the level that it needs treatment, because disorders need treatment, right? And so disorders means that the problems rises to the level of where it's disruptive and distressing and out of the typical realm for the person, or what we would consider in most situations. So PTSD, like many others, is what it says it is: post trauma stress problems is another way you could say it, right? So let me ask you this before we talk about these 5 core symptoms. What do you know about post-traumatic stress disorder? You know a little bit. What I just told you right there. You know what the letters stand for. Do you know a little bit about trauma? Do you know a little bit about PTSD? You might think about post-traumatic stress disorder as it relates to the military and combat veterans, and that is not inappropriate at all. That's kind of how we connect PTSD, and a lot of times in our mind as we see it as kind of a military veteran, combat veteran disorder or diagnosis. What makes it interesting about PTSD is that's really where this diagnosis and disorder came from, so to speak. Now, PTSD has been around forever, but the term post-traumatic stress disorder is really not that old. We're talking less than about 40 or 45 years old. It's not that long. And so, the term schizophrenia and other terms have been around forever. PTSD as a term and as an actual clinical diagnosis is not that old. But the experience of trauma has been around since the beginning of time. And so it really wasn't until after the Vietnam War in the 1970s that this thing called post-traumatic stress disorder was diagnosed. So that kind of is a part of PTSD's unique history, is that it really was kind of initially created out of research through the Department of Veterans Affairs with Vietnam veterans, men primarily, who came back from the Vietnam conflict in from our American military. And what the VA realized in the 70s was that there were large numbers, growing numbers of men who came back and were suicidal. They came back from combat and they were having nightmares and flashbacks. They came back and families were saying, then they're different. Their personality has completely been changed. They had all kinds of emotional and psychological distress and problems. Now, that wasn't anything new with combat veterans. You might be familiar with the term combat fatigue or shell shock. Those are two terms that you kind of were prior to Vietnam, that referred to men and Civil War, Revolutionary War, World War I, Korea, World War II. We knew that men and women, but men especially back in that day, would sometimes, not all, but they would come home and they would have flashbacks and struggles readjusting to society. And after the Vietnam conflict in the 1970s, we just saw those numbers like quadrupling. And the VA began to become concerned that, hey, we really have an issue here on our hand. And they began to research this idea of post-traumatic combat stress. And out of that came post-traumatic stress disorder. So it has kind of a unique history. PTSD also has a unique cause. Here's what I mean by that. Sometimes people will say to me, Professor Killian, well, what causes schizophrenia? Well, schizophrenia is a brain-based neurological condition. Yeah, but why does one person struggle with schizophrenia and someone else doesn't? Well, we don't always know the answer to that. Professor Killian, what causes depression? Well, depression is caused by environmental events. It can be caused by environmental events, as we've already talked about, but also too it can be caused by, it's really more of a brain chemistry thing. Well, why does one person battle depression and another person doesn't? Well, we don't always know the answer to that question. We don't always know what causes certain problems. We know what causes PTSD. Okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder, the T of PTSD is the core. We do not diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder unless someone's experienced trauma, at least a single event or multiple. But we'll talk about that just here in a second. So it's the first core symptom. It's not really even a symptom, but it's really an event. And so PTSD has a unique cause. We know what causes PTSD. Trauma is what causes post-traumatic stress disorder. We can't always say that with every single disorder, but we know that trauma is at the core of this diagnosis and disorder. So it makes it very, very unusual and unique. It has a unique cause. It also has a unique course. And here's what I mean by that. You've heard me say in this class many, many times, including even in this module, that most mental health conditions have their age of onset between the ages of 15 and 25, late adolescence to early adulthood. Post-traumatic stress disorder is one of those unusual disorders that someone can develop at any point of the lifespan, because you and I can experience trauma at any point in our lives. Just because you've never experienced a traumatic event, I'm not trying to be negative or pessimistic, doesn't mean you won't tomorrow. And it's true for me too. We can experience trauma at any point in the lifespan. So a person can develop the symptoms of PTSD at age 5 or 95 or 26 or 76, because we can experience trauma at any point in the lifespan. So that gives PTSD its unique course and then its unique expansion. I said a second ago that post-traumatic stress disorder's unique history was that it was developed really for combat veterans. And for about the first 15 years that it was in existence as a diagnosis, it was only diagnosed in combat veterans. Well, then we eventually realized, hey, are combat veterans the only people who experience trauma? And we realized, no, actually, a lot of people, any of us can experience trauma. We'll talk about here in just a second. So it was expanded just a few years ago to where now post-traumatic stress disorder is diagnosed and can be diagnosed in a wide range of people. It's not just a veteran, a combat veteran, or military veteran diagnosis only. We do see it a lot in combat veterans because combat is traumatic. But we also see it in other populations and other situations as well, which we'll talk about here in just a second. So before we talk about these 5 core symptoms, let me also highlight for you just some key additional facts. I've got, again, all of this is in your lecture notes. This little video is just intended to be, just kind of a little bit of a summary of what I've already got down for you in black and white in your lecture notes. Again, with post-traumatic stress disorder, there can be a wide range of variability in how we see it present itself in people's lives. That's true of every single diagnosis. I think I've said that with every single disorder we've covered in this class. The issue of variability, that although there is a standard core set of symptoms, the way in which a particular struggle can show itself in someone's lives can vary from person to person to person to person. Post-traumatic stress disorder is often comorbid with substance use disorders. Many people self-medicate their PTSD symptoms with drugs and alcohol. And so we'll talk about substance use disorders next section. But many people, if you're going to be a substance abuse counselor, you're going to deal and talk to lots of people about trauma, because a lot of people, that's how they began using substances, was to numb the memories of, the pain of a traumatic event. So substance use disorders and PTSD are oftentimes comorbid. Also, too, major depressive disorder or major depression and PTSD are oftentimes comorbid. We'll talk about depression here in a little bit, because one of the core symptoms is kind of a mild depression kind of a symptom. And so in some cases, you see people who are diagnosed both with post-traumatic stress disorder and major depression. And oftentimes a very common kind of a triple header, so to speak, a very common diagnosis we see is post-traumatic stress disorder along with major depressive disorder, along with a substance use disorder. Very common. We see those 3. People battle depression because of a trauma. They have major depressive disorder symptoms, PTSD symptoms, and if we're not careful, they also too have begun to self-medicate those symptoms with substances. So you have a substance use disorder that often and can at times develop. So that's oftentimes what we call a tri-diagnosis. That's a common tri-diagnosis that we oftentimes see. And then the last thing is this, I highlight this in your notes for you as well too, that oftentimes the symptoms of PTSD often begin immediately after someone is exposed to a traumatic event. So the P of PTSD, post-traumatic, means after trauma. And so in some cases, people begin to experience the symptoms of PTSD immediately after, within 3 or 4 days, within a week or 2 after I've experienced a traumatic event. the symptoms of PTSD begin. But there are other instances where there's what's called a delayed onset. The DSM says a delayed onset is when someone has no symptoms for at least 6 months and then they begin. Sometimes students will say, whoa, 6 months? Do people sometimes go like 6 months before they begin to exhibit symptoms after a trauma? Yes, often. That's not uncommon at all, actually. You may remember back in, if you were of a certain age, you may remember at 9/11. 9/11 happened in 2001. And there were many, many stories of men and women who began to struggle with PTSD symptoms after 9/11 because the tragedy in America of 9/11 triggered their thoughts and memories of a trauma they had experienced. They were not traumatized in 9/11. Maybe they had served in combat somewhere. Maybe they had been in a house fire or a building collapse or something like that, like with 9/11 or a plane crash. They'd survived it. And when 9/11 happened, then suddenly they began to have all these PTSD kinds of symptoms, in some cases years later. We see that sometimes. And so sometimes the symptoms can and do begin immediately. Other times there is a delayed onset. So a complicated, very interesting, highly treatable disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, has 5 core symptoms. And the first one is an interesting symptom because it's not really a symptom, it's more of an experience. Symptom number 1 of post-traumatic stress disorder is exposure to trauma. So we do not diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder unless someone has had exposure to a traumatic event or events. So the DSM identifies trauma as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And it kind of then further identifies that sometimes trauma can be directly experiencing actual threatened death or harm or sexual violence towards me. Trauma can also be witnessing it happening to somebody else. So it may not happen to me, but I may witness someone else being harmed or someone else being killed or someone else being violated. I'm not being violated or threatened, but I see someone else. Many, many years ago, I worked with a client who had many, many symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. I won't go into all the details, it's not appropriate, but they had witnessed a friend of theirs being killed in a car accident in front of them. And so they had pulled over to the side of the road on a freeway to change a tire. And while the person was standing there, they witnessed their friend being hit by a car on the freeway. Now, they were never in danger. They were never hit. It was probably 15, 20 feet from them, but they witnessed someone else being killed. And that was a very traumatic event for them. And they had many symptoms, almost every single symptom of PTSD as a result of this, of witnessing a traumatic event happening to someone else. That would qualify. In some instances, it can also be traumatic. The DSM says when I learn of a traumatic event happening to someone, I wasn't there and didn't see it, but I heard the details, and especially when there's violence, or when there's like a violent accident or there's violence towards a person, you may be hearing the details of someone being harmed who I love, who I care for. That could also be potentially traumatic. And then also too, some of our first responders, police officers, CPS workers, paramedics, medical professionals who continually deal with the news and hear the stories of and have to deal with very, very difficult situations, very, very traumatic over time. That can also qualify as trauma as well too, even though it's a part of their job. So trauma is got this real basic kind of definition. It's got some other qualifiers, and then there are these traumatic events. So again, we sometimes think about trauma just being combat or war, but the DSM gives us some other details. So for example, it tells us that physical and or sexual assaults, including domestic and relationship violence or sexual abuse or sexual molestation or being raped, those would qualify as being traumatic events, obviously. Being the victim in a natural disaster, tornado, hurricane, or a flood or a house fire, near-death experiences where I'm involved in a car accident, where I'm trapped especially, or where I believe that, where I almost died, or where I thought I was going to die. Life-threatening, near-death kinds of experiences, natural disaster kinds of things can also meet the criteria for trauma. So trauma really can and does look a number of different ways. I had a student a couple semesters back, and she did her internship in a local children's assessment center, where part of what the agency does is interviews children who have been physically abused, neglected, or sexually abused. And that was kind of what she wanted to do. She wanted to be like a trauma therapist for children. And she shared in class one day a little bit about what she was learning in her internship. And really what she talked about the entire time she was speaking to the class was really about trauma. And she said, she said, that's really what we deal with. We deal with kids who have been, in many cases, very severely abused and neglected and sexually abused and physically abused. And she said, really what we do is we deal and assess their trauma because they have many of them PTSD kinds of symptoms. And not that they're diagnosed with that, but I thought that was a great example of how, that has nothing to do with combat or military. It's more of a domestic kind of a situation, family relationship kind of situation. But we oftentimes see that meets the criteria as trauma. So that's the first symptom. The first symptom is exposure to a real life traumatic event or events. So it sort of starts there. Symptoms 2, 3, 4, and 5 are really more the traditional symptoms, and really what those are. There's 4 of them, and they're what we call the DSM refers to them as clusters. There are these 4 clusters or categories of stress-related symptoms, and that constitutes symptom 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's trauma plus 4. So 4 and 1's 5. So these 4 stress-related symptoms I've broken down for you and given you in the DSM. If you read the section on PTSD in the DSM, you see the DSM gives us lots of information and lots of examples. And so and oftentimes there's an overlap between these 4. So here's the first one. Number 1 is what we call re-experiencing symptoms or intrusion symptoms. So after a trauma, as the result of a trauma, symptom number 1, then a person either immediately or delayed begins to experience what we call re-experiencing symptoms. Now, that can look a lot of different ways. Re-experiencing symptoms could be someone could begin to have flashbacks to what they've been through. They have distressing nightmares or dreams about it. They have memories, sort of like with OCD. We talked about with OCD and an obsession. An obsession is like an intrusive thought. After people have been through a trauma, sometimes they have these weird thoughts. They aren't trying to think about, seeing my friend killed in front of me, but I'm just sitting there listening to a conversation, and suddenly the image kind of jumps into my mind. It'll be like a re-experiencing kind of a symptom. Having the experience or feeling like the event's about to happen again or going to happen again or is happening again. All of those would be examples. Having physiological and or psychological overreactions whenever I'm triggered would be a react. So anytime I experience a stimulus, could be a sound, a smell, a conversation, or whatever, that reminds me of the trauma, having physical, and or psychological, emotional overreactivity, as if the event's happening again. Those would all be examples of re-experiencing symptoms. Many years ago, I was actually teaching this class during summer school, and we were wrapping up the class. It was right after July. If you've been in summer school during summer one, we wrap up right after July the 4th. And a lady who was taking this very class shared with me how they had gone to the Woodlands Mall for the 4th of July fireworks, and how her husband was a combat veteran and how they had to leave early. She shared that with me in private. We had moved off of PT. We'd already talked about PTSD a couple of weeks earlier. And when we came back from the July 4th holiday, wrapping the class up, she shared with me how he had just come back from a tour of duty, military combat, and how they had gone down to the fireworks, and the booming of the fireworks had kind of set off like this mild to severe panic attack. He'd been triggered, we would say. And they had to get out of there and leave, get their kids gathered up and just take off and go home. And she said it was really, she said he did, it was unexpected for him. He was kind of triggered. And so that would be an example we call a re-experiencing symptom. So it would be like one category or cluster of symptoms is the re-experiencing or intrusive symptoms. The second is what we call avoidance symptoms. And sometimes, again, there's an overlap between these different classifications and classes and categories and clusters. The second would be the avoidance symptoms. So as a result of a trauma, people try to avoid people, conversations, thoughts, memories, places that remind them of something related to the trauma. So someone with PTSD, for example, may ask you to change the subject if you keep asking them questions about what they're going through. They may avoid people who remind them. They may avoid situations that remind them and trigger them. So you see patterns of avoidance. You see patterns of re-experiencing. Those two often go together. Because I'm re-experiencing because I'm having these re-experiencing symptoms, I naturally then try to avoid those situations so I don't have to re-experience. So those two go together sometimes. Re-experiencing symptoms of patterns of active avoidance of people, situations, conversations, feelings, that remind me of or that I associate with the traumatic event. So again, it's both in the DSM says it's both internal and external. So I avoid external reminders. I also do my best to avoid internal thoughts or memories or whatever it may be. Uh, trying to avoid thinking about what I went through, those kind of things. So re-experiencing, and then the avoidance, and then the next two. Here's kind of the mild depression one. The third kind of cluster, it's actually symptom number 4, is what the DSM calls negative mood and thinking. Now, this is really, really broad and can look a bunch of different ways. You remember our conversation on major depressive disorder? To me, I oftentimes call this mild depression. So people with PTSD oftentimes have, at a minimum, some mildly depressive kinds of symptoms. They may have gaps in their memory where they don't remember certain aspects of the traumatic event. They may struggle with survivor's guilt or feeling guilty about not doing more to prevent something from happening to themselves or someone else. They may have kind of some dysphoria and anhedonia, a lack or loss of enjoyment in activities that I used to like to engage myself in. Now I don't. They feel detached. They don't smile anymore. They have lots of periods of anger and guilt and fear and lots of negative emotions that again were not present at the level that they are now before the trauma. So kind of the idea with PTSD, one of the great assessment questions we ask when we do evaluations of post-traumatic stress disorder is when clients are telling us about their struggles, I always say, now I usually ask this question. So, you're talking about feeling really detached. Has that gotten better or worse or the same since the trauma? So before the trauma, let's say it was a car accident or a house fire or combat. So before you went into the military, before you were sexually assaulted, let me ask you a question. Before that, did you feel detached then? And what you almost always hear with post-traumatic stress disorder is no. It's just been since then. Well, that's post-trauma, right? So all these symptoms, kind of this idea of made worse or have started since the traumatic event. So lots of negative mood and thinking kinds of symptoms that we oftentimes see. They're kind of very similar to depression. Now, sometimes these negative mood thinking symptoms are so severe, they actually rise to the level of major depressive disorder. But at a minimum, it's very common for us with post-traumatic stress disorder to have some minimum mildly depressive, negative emotions and thoughts, that kind of thing. Pessimism, thinking and seeing that the world is a dangerous place, not trusting people. Those kinds of patterns, we often see that as a result of trauma. That's sort of the third kind of symptom, the negative mood and thinking. And then the last one is increased arousal. So the three kind of clusters, it's trauma plus four, trauma plus four, totaling 5. There is the re-experiencing or intrusion symptoms, avoidance, negative mood thinking, and the last one is the increased or heightened arousal. So again, kind of similar to what we just talked about. Often that can include patterns of being highly irritable and having a short temper or a short fuse. Again, that easily angered, easily agitated in ways that are different from how the person was prior to the trauma. Sometimes we see after a traumatic event, people engage in highly reckless behavior. They engage, oftentimes, unfortunately, that can go with alcohol. Someone oftentimes with post-traumatic stress disorder then gets drunk or high, and then while they're drunk or high, then they engage in really reckless kind of behavior, which can look a bunch of different ways. They have insomnia. Oftentimes, they have some sleep disturbance. They're overly jumpy, have a heightened, they have sort of an increased startle response, and so little noises and things kind of make them real jumpy. That again is unusual for them. Many people with post-traumatic stress disorder are real leery of their surroundings. They become a little mildly paranoid when they go out, always looking over their shoulder. When they go into a restaurant or somewhere or classroom, they sit in the back. Now it depends on the person. Some people with post-traumatic stress disorder, like in a college classroom, I've had lots of students, they sit in the back because they can see everything. So because in our classrooms, you come in from the front. They sit in the back so they can see everything. That's their comfort zone. Other people with post-traumatic stress disorder sit at the front by the door, kind of like someone with agoraphobia, sit near the front. So that way I can get out. But the problem with sitting in the front, I got a bunch of people behind me. And so sometimes when people have experienced trauma, one of the ways we see the heightened arousal symptom is they're a little leery of who is it behind me, so they sit in the back. So that way, the only thing behind me is the window. I can see everybody. It's my way to kind of control, my environment. So that's one way we sometimes see that. We call that just increased or heightened arousal. So post-traumatic stress disorder has these 5 symptoms. The first one is trauma, and then there are these 4 clusters of these stress-related symptoms. The re-experiencing or intrusion symptoms, the avoidance symptoms, the negative mood and thinking, and then the increased arousal. So go into the module, find the PowerPoint presentation, find the lecture notes, go into the module and find the videos I posted for you, the little case scenarios, and look at all of that and get ready to do your homework and take your quiz. Read the section in the DSM on PTSD. Again, post-traumatic stress disorder is a complex, complicated disorder, but it's got 5 very, very clear kind of concrete symptoms. Trauma plus these 4 stress-related symptoms. And again, easiest way to remember PTSD is it is what it says it is. Okay, come back next module, and we'll just keep on rolling our way through the DSM, and hope you have a great couple of weeks, and I'll see you then.